Algae appears to be on the rise in Lake Okeechobee. New reports have high concentrations in some spots.
And there's growing concern over releasing that water to the Treasure Coast.
The drone footage from Lake Okeechobee was never meant to leave the operations room. It is just after midnight when the latest pass comes back from the gates. And on the monitor, something dark is lifting up off the bottom of the largest freshwater lake in Florida. It blooms outward.
I can see blue-green algae up and down the shores of Lake Okeechobee. What environmentalists do not want to see is this blue-green algae heading east towards the St. Lucie estuary.
The water turns the color of black tea. Then two plumes split from the same source, one bleeding toward the Atlantic, the other toward the Gulf. Both at once, both visible from the air. For a long moment, nobody in the room speaks. Then someone reaches over and stops everything. The big water. To understand what that footage actually showed, you have to understand what Lake Okeechobee is. It is the largest freshwater lake in the state of Florida, 730 square miles of it, the second largest freshwater lake contained entirely within the lower 48 United States. Here is the thing people don't grasp until they're standing on it. Get out on the southern shore, and you cannot see the northern horizon. There is only sky and water and the slow-moving haze of Florida heat sitting on the surface like a lid. The Calusa called it Miami. The Spanish called it Laguna de Espiritu Santo. The Seminole called it Okeechobee, which means big water. That last name is the one that stuck. And look, for more than a century, this lake has been the beating heart of South Florida's water system. It feeds the Everglades. It supports the agricultural economy of the entire central part of the state. It supplies drinking water to over 8 million people. It is connected by a series of man-made canals to both the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast and the Gulf of Mexico on the west. That last detail is the one that matters more than anything else in this story. When something goes wrong at Lake Okeechobee, it does not stay at Lake Okeechobee. It travels. In December 2024, the South Florida Water Management District made a decision that, on paper, looked like every other decision they had made for the last 50 years. Lake levels were running high. The Army Corps of Engineers, which has managed the lake's outflows since the 1930s, ordered a controlled release, lower the water by several inches, spread it out over a few weeks, take pressure off the aging earthen wall around the lake, let sunlight back into the submerged grass beds inside it. It was textbook. It had been done dozens of times before. Stay with me here, because what happened next was not in any of the textbooks. Within 48 hours of the gates opening, imagery analysts were watching a stain spread across their monitors that should not have existed. Aerial passes and orbital sensors were both picking it up. Plumes of black water moving down the St. Lucie River toward the Atlantic. Plumes of black water moving down the Caloosahatchee River toward the Gulf. Both at once. Both visible from above. Both rising up out of the same source. Whatever had been sitting at the bottom of Lake Okeechobee, waiting for exactly the wrong management decision to wake it up, was now in motion. And it was moving toward 8 million people. The wall. Before we go any further, you need to know why Lake Okeechobee has a wall around it, and what that wall was built to contain. The lake is shallow, remarkably shallow for its size. The average depth is only about 9 feet. In some places, you can wade hundreds of yards from shore before the water reaches your waist. That shallowness made the lake extraordinarily sensitive to weather, and extraordinarily dangerous during storms. Now, picture this. On September 16, 1928, a Category 5 hurricane made landfall near Palm Beach, Florida. The storm had already devastated Puerto Rico and the Bahamas. When it reached Florida, it carried sustained winds of 145 miles per hour directly over Lake Okeechobee. The lake had no containment system. It was surrounded by low-lying farmland, much of it worked by black migrant laborers who harvested beans, sugarcane, and winter vegetables in the rich muck soil at the edge of the Everglades. When the hurricane's winds shoved the lake's water against the southern shore, the natural banks collapsed. A wall of water swept across the farmland in the dark. The official death toll was 2,500. The real number was almost certainly higher, possibly over 3,000. Most of the victims were black agricultural workers whose deaths were never formally recorded. Graves were dug, bodies were burned, At the time, it was the second deadliest natural disaster in American history. And here's the part that should bother you. It was entirely preventable. In the aftermath, the federal government ordered a containment system. The Army Corps of Engineers began work on the Herbert Hoover Dike, a 143-mile earthen levee that would completely encircle Lake Okeechobee, transforming it from a natural lake into a controlled reservoir. By the 1960s, the lake was fully contained. Water could no longer escape over the natural banks. It could only leave through controlled outlets, canals, and spillways, managed by the Army Corps on strict operational schedules. The lake that had killed thousands was now under human control, or so everyone believed. The sink. Here's what nobody tells you about that wall. The dike did not just contain the lake, it changed what the lake was. Before the wall, Okeechobee's waters flowed naturally southward into the Everglades. They filtered through marshland that cleaned and dispersed the water over hundreds of miles. A slow-moving river of grass that stretched from central Florida all the way to Florida Bay. That had been the system for thousands of years. The dike cut it off. The Everglades were drained for agriculture. The land between the lake and the remaining wetlands became the Everglades agricultural area. Hundreds of thousands of acres of sugarcane, vegetables, and cattle planted on that rich muck soil. Florida's year-round growing season turned the belt into one of the most productive farming regions in the country, an industry worth billions annually. But here's the part nobody wanted to think about. Farming at this scale requires fertilizer, and fertilizer contains phosphorus. For decades, agricultural runoff flowed back into Lake Okeechobee. Think about what that means. Phosphorus, essential in trace amounts, devastating in excess, accumulated in the lake's water, and eventually in its sediment. The shallow lake acted as a settling pond. Year after year, decade after decade, the sediment layer at the bottom grew thicker and more dangerous. If this is the first you are hearing about what is buried under that lake, do me a quick favor and hit the like button and subscribe before we keep going. The rest of this story is exactly the kind of thing that gets buried by people who do not want it traveling. The algorithm is the only reason it travels at all. By the 1990s, scientists were already warning about what they called legacy phosphorus. Decades of agricultural runoff stored in the bottom mud, just sitting there, waiting. In December 2024, the conditions to release it finally arrived, and the system that was supposed to control the lake was about to do the one thing it could not take back: the trap. Let me explain why this lake is a trap, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Lake Okeechobee cannot overflow its banks anymore. The Herbert Hoover Dike prevents that. But the lake has to be held within a narrow range of water levels, too high, and the aging dike is at risk of failure, too low, and the lake's ecology collapses. When the lake rises above safe levels, the Army Corps of Engineers has only two real options. They can release water east through the St. Lucie Canal toward the Atlantic, or they can release it west through the Caloosahatchee River toward the Gulf. Both of those choices are ecological disasters. There is a senior water manager with the South Florida Water Management District whose job is to make exactly this call. Picture him in the control room in West Palm Beach, gauges in front of him, two coasts on the line. He has said in interviews that this is the worst job in the state of Florida. Every time the numbers climb, somebody in that room has to choose which coast to poison. There is no third door. There has not been one for 60 years. The St. Lucie River runs through Martin and St. Lucie counties on Florida's Treasure Coast, eventually emptying into the Indian River Lagoon, one of the most biodiverse estuaries in North America. The lagoon supports over 4,000 species of plants and animals, manatees, dolphins, sea turtles. It is not designed to receive massive pulses of fresh water from a polluted lake. So watch what happens when Okeechobee water is released eastward. It floods the estuary with fresh water and throws off the salinity balance that marine and brackish species depend on. Worse, it brings nutrients with it, the phosphorus and nitrogen that fuel explosive algae growth. The result is algae blooms, including toxic cyanobacteria that produce compounds dangerous to humans and animals. Green slime coats the surface. Fish kills number in the millions. Manatees starve as the seagrass beds they depend on are smothered. The 2016 algae bloom on the Treasure Coast was one of the worst environmental disasters in Florida history. The governor declared a state of emergency. Beaches were closed, tourism cratered, property values along the St. Lucie River collapsed. And the Caloosahatchee River on the west coast faces the exact same dynamics. Releases toward the Gulf feed red tide events caused by an organism called Karenia brevis, which produces neurotoxins that kill fish by the millions and cause respiratory problems in people who breathe the air near affected beaches. The 2018 red tide event killed over 2,000 tons of marine life along Florida's Gulf Coast. Dead fish, manatees, dolphins, and sea turtles washed up on beaches from Naples to Tampa Bay. The tourism industry lost hundreds of millions of dollars. Both coasts have been held hostage to this lake's management for decades. But the December 2024 event was different. And the man in that West Palm Beach control room was the first person to see it happen. The readings coming back from the canals were unlike anything in the operational history of the dike. He watched the numbers climb on his screen, climb past where they should have stopped, then keep going, past anything a controlled lowering of a few inches could possibly produce. He had run this operation before. He had never seen the screen do this. Something else was coming up out of the lake. The rising. The release that began in December 2024 was planned according to the Army Corps' standard procedures. The Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual called for keeping water levels within a specific target range. The release was scheduled to lower the lake by several inches over several weeks. The rate was modest by historical standards. The timing was chosen to avoid peak tourist season. The operation was coordinated with state environmental agencies. Everything was done by the book. What the book did not account for was what was sitting at the bottom of the lake. Here's the part nobody planned for. Moving large volumes of water creates turbulence. Currents form. Sediment that has been undisturbed for years can be stirred up off the bottom. Under normal circumstances, this is minor. Some nutrients might be temporarily elevated. Nothing catastrophic. But Lake Okeechobee's sediment is not normal sediment. It holds 70 years of accumulated agricultural runoff. Phosphorus concentrations in the bottom muck are among the highest ever recorded in a natural water body anywhere in the world. And it's not just phosphorus. The sediment also contains organic matter. Decades of dead algae, decomposed plant material, accumulated biological waste in quantities that dwarf anything the management models had ever anticipated. So, when the December 2024 release began, the disturbance of the lake bottom was more severe than predicted. The sediment did not stir slightly, it mobilized. Clouds of legacy muck rose up off the bottom into the water column and mixed with the water being pushed out through the canals. That is the rising. That is what was on the footage. Now, here's where it gets worse, and you need to follow this part closely. As the muck-laden water moved downstream, the organic matter inside it began to decompose. Decomposition consumes oxygen. When large quantities of organic matter decompose rapidly, they can strip the dissolved oxygen out of the water to levels that kill fish and anything else trying to breathe in it. Scientists call this hypoxia, low oxygen. In extreme cases, anoxia, no oxygen at all. The water leaving Lake Okeechobee in December 2024 became hypoxic within hours. And it carried something else? Stay with me, because this is the detail that makes the footage make sense. Tannins, organic compounds released by decomposing plant matter. The same compounds that give tea its color. When massive quantities of decomposing organic material release their tannins into water, the water turns dark, then darker, then black. That's why the plumes lit up the imagery within 48 hours of the release. They were visible because of their color. The water moving down the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee rivers was dark enough to be told apart from normal water from above. Within days, the black water reached the coastal estuaries. Within a week, it was visible in the near-shore waters of both the Atlantic and the Gulf. The color was striking. The implications were worse, because nobody yet knew what was actually inside that water, what the bottles held. A field biologist with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection waded out into the St. Lucie River at sunrise on a Saturday, sample bottles in hand, and stopped. She had been told to expect discoloration. She had not been told the river would feel viscous against her legs. She filled her bottles. She labeled them. She walked them back to the truck without saying much. The smell, she would tell colleagues later, was not algae. It was older than algae. It was something that had been buried. When the lab results came back, they were the kind of numbers that get rechecked twice before anyone signs off on them. Phosphorus levels were off the charts. And I don't mean the elevated levels typical of an Okeechobee release. I mean concentrations that exceeded anything previously recorded during a release event. The legacy mud at the bottom of the lake had been stirred up, and it was now flowing toward both coasts. Dissolved oxygen was nearly zero in some samples. Think about what that means for a second. The water was functionally dead, unable to support any aerobic life. A fish swimming into one of these plumes would suffocate within minutes. The samples also held bacterial concentrations that pointed to decomposing organic matter in quantities that would fuel algae blooms for months. Here's the way to think about it. The phosphorus in that water was, in effect, fertilizer. Once it reached the estuaries, it would feed algae growth on a massive scale. 70 years of nutrients accumulated in Lake Okeechobee's sediment were now being delivered in concentrated form to the coastal ecosystems of both Florida coasts at the same time. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection issued health advisories for water contact along both the Treasure Coast and the Lee County coast. Swimming was discouraged. Fishing was warned against. Those advisories stayed in effect for a long time. And the field biologist who filled those first bottles, she would later tell a reporter she had stopped letting her children swim in any waterway connected to the lake, not just for now, indefinitely. Because what was in those bottles was not going to flush out to sea and disappear. It was going to feed something. The only question was what and where and how soon. The coasts go dark. The immediate damage was visible within days, and it started with the things people could see and smell. On the Treasure Coast, the St. Lucie River turned the color of dark chocolate. Fish kills began almost immediately. Mullet, snook, and bait fish floating belly up along the riverbanks. The smell of decomposition spread across waterfront neighborhoods. There is a charter captain who had run fishing trips out of Stewart for 26 years. Picture him pulling into the dock that first week, looking at the water, and then canceling every booking on his calendar through February. He told his customers the truth. The fish were dead. The water was poison. He could not in good conscience put a paying client into it. He had survived the 2016 bloom. He had survived the 2018 red tide. This, he said, was different, and it kept getting worse. The Indian River Lagoon, already stressed from years of nutrient pollution, took another massive pulse of phosphorus and nitrogen. Scientists who had been tracking the lagoon's slow recovery from the 2016 bloom watched the water quality metrics they had monitored for years collapse back to crisis levels in real time. The seagrass beds, the foundation of the lagoon's entire ecosystem, the feeding grounds for manatees, the nursery habitat for commercial fish species, were smothered by the sediment-laden water. Sunlight could not get through the murky surface. Photosynthesis stopped. The grass began to die. And here is the detail that makes this one land harder. Manatees in the Indian River Lagoon had already been dying in record numbers from seagrass loss. Over 1,000 manatees died in Florida in 2021 alone, most from starvation after seagrass die-offs. The December 2024 event threatened to trigger another mass mortality event right on top of an ecosystem that had not yet recovered from the last one. On the west coast, the Caloosahatchee River carried the same toxic payload toward the Gulf, the water spreading into San Carlos Bay, and the waters around Sanibel and Captiva Islands was visibly discolored, carrying the unmistakable signature of Lake Okeechobee's disturbed sediment. Red tide had already been present at low levels along the Gulf Coast, and the nutrient pulse from Okeechobee gave the Karenia brevis organism exactly the fuel it needed to bloom explosively. Within weeks, red tide concentrations were spiking along the Lee County coast. Dead fish washed up on beaches. Respiratory irritation was reported by residents and tourists. The tourism industry, already recovering from previous red tide events, took another devastating blow. Fishing guides canceled charters. Hotels reported cancellations. Real estate agents watched property values wobble in waterfront communities. The exact economic toll is still being calculated. But previous events tell you what's coming. The 2018 red tide event caused an estimated $184 million in losses in Lee County alone. The 2016 algae bloom on the Treasure Coast caused similar damage. This time, it hit both coasts at once. And that raised a question nobody in any of those control rooms wanted to be the one to answer. The question nobody wants to answer. Can this be fixed? That's the question. And the answer is the reason this story does not have an ending you're going to like. There is a wetlands ecologist who has spent the last 15 years working on Everglades restoration. Picture his office in Gainesville, a graduate student sitting across the desk from him, asking the obvious question, can't we just pull it back out? He doesn't soften it. The phosphorus is not coming back out, he tells them. There is no machine, there is no chemical. There is no contractor on the planet who can vacuum legacy nutrients out of 730 square miles of lake bottom muck. And then he lets the room go quiet because that's the part the models never put in writing. The contamination is permanent, so the only options left are management strategies that try to minimize disturbance of the sediment. Keep the lake at stable levels. Avoid operations that create turbulence near the bottom. Except, certain management actions are now off the table because the consequences are too severe. But here's the trap closing. Those strategies conflict with everything else. The Herbert Hoover Dike is aging. Sections of the 143-mile levee are at risk of failure during major storms. Rehabilitation work has been ongoing for years, but the dike was never designed to last forever. When lake levels rise, the dike is stressed. Releases become necessary for safety. Climate change is intensifying Florida's rainfall patterns. The frequency of high water events at Lake Okeechobee is increasing, and 8 million people still depend on the lake for drinking water. Agriculture still depends on it for irrigation. So, sit with the position they are actually in. Keep the lake high, and the dike is at risk. Lower the lake, and legacy pollution gets released. Send water south to the Everglades. And the remaining wetlands receive nutrient-laden water that damages their ecology. Send water to the coasts, and the estuaries collapse. Every single option is bad. There is no clean one left. The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, authorized in the year 2000, was supposed to be the way out. A more than $10 billion federal-state partnership designed to restore the natural flow of water through South Florida. Reservoirs, treatment marshes, modified water management practices intended to reduce harmful discharges from Lake Okeechobee while restoring the Everglades ecosystem. But the plan is decades behind schedule. Political opposition, funding shortfalls, and bureaucratic delays have slowed it to a crawl. Key components remain unbuilt. The reservoirs that were supposed to store excess Okeechobee water and treat it before release are still in planning or early construction phases. December 2024 happened in the gap between the old system and the new one. The legacy infrastructure could not handle it. The restoration infrastructure does not exist yet. And that is the part you have to hold on to. Because it means December 2024 was not the accident, it was the rehearsal. The legacy phosphorus is still in the lake. The sediment is still there. The next time water managers need to lower the lake, the next hurricane season, the next wet winter, the next infrastructure emergency, the same dynamics play out. Turbulence disturbs the sediment. Legacy pollution mobilizes. Black water rises up off the bottom and flows toward the coasts. The only variable is how severe each event will be. And here's the thought that should keep you up. Lake Okeechobee is not unique. Across the United States, lakes and reservoirs that have served as agricultural sinks for decades face exactly the same problem. The Great Lakes hold legacy pollution from a century of industrial and agricultural activity. Chesapeake Bay has struggled with nutrient runoff that has created dead zones for decades. The Mississippi River carries agricultural pollution from the entire Midwest down to the Gulf of Mexico, feeding a hypoxic dead zone the size of New Jersey, and climate change is intensifying every one of them. Warmer water holds less oxygen. More intense rainfall mobilizes sediment more aggressively. So, here is where it leaves us. Lake Okeechobee, big water, has been the beating heart of South Florida for centuries. The wall we built around it after the 1928 hurricane was supposed to make it safe. It made it a trap instead. Everything that flowed in stayed in, settled to the bottom, and waited. In December 2024, we disturbed it, and 70 years of accumulated damage came up at once, spread across two coastlines, visible from the air. Both coasts are contaminated. The Indian River Lagoon is dying. The Gulf is fighting another red tide, and the lake still sits in the center of it, still full, still connected to 8 million people's drinking water, still the only place the Army Corps can send the water when the rains come and the dike needs protection. There is no solution. There is only management, and management just failed in front of a camera. December 2024 was the warning. The next one will not look like a warning. It will look like the thing the warning was about. Lake Okeechobee is big water. What is in it is bigger, and it is not staying at the bottom anymore. If this is the first time you are hearing what really came up out of Lake Okeechobee, drop a comment and tell us what you think should happen next. Should the releases be stopped? Should the dike come down? Should the Everglades restoration plan be fast-tracked before the next hurricane season hits? We read every comment. And if you want to know what the next environmental warning sign looks like, the one nobody is paying attention to yet, the next video is already waiting for you on the screen. Click it now before it happens.